You have just come out of some heated media with the BBC.
Free speech, where does it begin? Where does it end? What's your view?
You are in a crisis, and they're in utter denial. Britain has started this process of trying to deal with serious social issues by just getting people to shut up.
Greg, I'm so sorry. We are out of time. Thank you very much.
And if that happened again, once, I would say that you're in a crisis. If this is happening routinely, so he was arrested, as you know, getting off an airplane.
You're under arrest. Holy shit! I don't fucking believe it.
Because he had sent some mean tweets. They've seen the videos as well of people being, old pensioners being arrested because they put a sign up that about 10,000 people are arrested every year for offensive speech on the internet.
What, in the UK?
In the UK, yeah.
10,000?
Yeah.
I want to understand, why do Americans care about Britain so much?
Oh, because
yesterday in Congress was hearings about British free speech.
At what point did we become North Korea?
I wanted to kind of get your analysis.
We're going to go back into tyranny.
I guess the most outrage about Trump's behavior, and it's been called an attack on free speech, has been at the universities.
Yeah. The one that we have the biggest issue with is how the Trump administration handled.
Greg Lukianoff, thank you so much for coming to speak with me here in Washington, D.C. You are sat with fire ablazoned across the official merch of your organization, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. That's how we've come to know each other over the years, fighting for free speech in America. There's lots I want to discuss with you. What free speech looks like under the Trump administration or the second Trump administration, what's going on campuses, particularly after October 7th, particularly after Trump's come back. I want to look at free speech in America more broadly, but you have just come out of some heated media with the BBC because you have been telling the British how perilous things are actually in the United Kingdom. And perhaps we can start like that on that specific issue. I note that your Vice President, J.D. Vance, has been saying relentlessly how bad the free speech situation is. In my opinion, he's done us a great favor.
I agree.
He's brought the conversation to the forefront, starting from the Munich conference in February, I believe it was, but every public meeting of Starmer, he seems to bring up the free speech thing. And the Online Safety Act, which actually started under the Conservatives, but has come through now under the Keir Starmer's Labour government, has is apparently got some impediments on American free speech. So I'm hoping we can get into all of that. But starting with Britain then, what's your, how are you seeing things unfolding?
Oh, yeah. So yesterday was just a crazy media day because first we had the Graham Linehan, am I saying
Graham
his name?
Linehan.
Linehan. Jesus, I was way off.
Yeah.
Saying his name right. So he was arrested, as you know, getting off an airplane because he had sent some mean tweets. One of them was saying that if you're a woman and you're in a female-only space and a biological male is in there, you should make a scene. It's illegal, and if all else fails, his final line was, punch them in the nuts.
Mm-hmm. Balls, I think.
Punch them in the balls?
Yes. But just for accuracy's sake.
Yeah. No, that's me going back to my old slang. It was... that would be unquestionably protected in the United States. It's, for one thing, obviously a joke, but it's also entirely conditional that if someone's doing something highly illegal, you can defend yourself. There is no world in which that should at least count as incitement. But they were, when I bring this up, in Britain, the level of cope that people have, the amount of like, well, that was hateful or that was, that should be banned. It just kind of blows me away. And I should point out, my mother's British. I spent a lot of time over there as a kid, and they used to laugh at us for our political correctness over there. And now they have outdone us by a country mile. So yesterday I did the BBC News about this because they were really concerned about these hearings about how speech restrictions in Britain and in the EU could be limiting free speech in the United States. And all of the questions I got from the BBC in advance was basically like, well, this is total hypocrisy. The Trump administration is doing this and that. And you can't impeach me with that, because it's like, yeah, we take on everybody.
Total bait and switch. So
Yeah.
instead of actually talking about the issue, they want to talk about Trump. Yeah.
Well, and so I wasn't really having it. I just talked about there being a free speech crisis there, and they said, well, people just agree with there being a free speech crisis, and I was like, no, there's a free speech crisis, and I pointed to some data that indicates that about 10,000 people are arrested every year for offensive speech on the internet, and this is a data from the Times.
What, in the UK?
In the UK, yeah,
10,000.
yeah.
I heard it was 30 a day.
Yeah,
Does that come out to 10,000?
That works out to be about 12,000. Because, and I'm just saying that it's been over 10,000 since 2021. And which, just to give you a sense of that, the first Red Scare in the United States was 2 years, and it was about 4,000 people arrested. So the idea that, and it's funny, like, I've been watching the freak out, in response to my appearance on the internet when I make these accusations. First, I get the, Americans were like, yeah, no, it sounds crazy. Then I get the Brits who realize there's a very serious problem. They've seen the videos as well of people being, old pensioners being arrested, because they put a sign up or said something on Facebook, oftentimes, accurate even. And then the people, really reacting to, there's nothing, this is all fine. And my favorite one was someone who came back and said, well, only about 1,000 of them were convicted each year. And I'm like,
yeah,
what you're saying is that more than 12,000 people being arrested for speech is no big deal because not that many of them are actually convicted. It's like, if you want to,
wait, sorry, but 1,000 is a lot of convictions.
It's a lot of, yeah, it's a lot of convictions. Then, and so that's but obviously you're going to chill speech if there's even
quite
any chance at all. If you convicted one person, people would chill their speech. Just if it happened even once. And this is something that we point to as a chilling effect in the United States all the time. It didn't take a whole lot of Socrateses for people to get the message, or Galileo for that matter. You just need to do it once. So doing it thousands of times is insane. And I made the point that that's the equivalent of arresting about 50,000 people per year in the United States, or 60,000 if you take the 12,000.
Yes.
And then when people are like, well, some of those might have been things involving like domestic violence or something like that, I also made the point that essentially there are other things that you would charge them with if it was that. But there's also this massive category of non-crime hate incidents.
Correct, yes.
Which is, I think the number's like in millions. Like
a quarter of a million since 2014.
A quarter of a million? Okay. And some of those might be things that would even be unprotected in the United States, but surely not all of them.
I mean, they're ludicrous. I mean, they include a young girl, a schoolgirl, getting one because she called another classmate that she said she smelled like fish. Someone else got one for hanging soiled jeans on a clothesline in the garden. Someone got one for whistling the Bob the Builder theme tune at someone walking down the street. I mean, they're utterly ludicrous. Anyone can get one. It's any perceived offence anywhere along the line, but it doesn't even have to include the person being quote unquote offended.
Yeah.
If anyone perceives anything to be offensive, you can report it to the police.
And if that happened again once, I would say that you're in a crisis. If this is happening routinely, you are in a crisis, and they're in utter denial about it. And even when I went over to do and I saw you there at the Battle of Ideas last year. When I went over, I was amazed at how much Britons would defend what was going on, even ones who were critical of it, or say it's really not that big of a deal. And I did Andrew Doyle's show, and I was like, you guys have lost your minds and sense of perspective. People have the right to talk about serious matters. And then people would bring up, some people are saying things that are offensive about immigration. And I'm like, in a lot of cases, they're talking about sexual assaults. It's like, can you imagine a more serious topic? And to be frank, that's an empirical question.
Yes,
like you need to have a cool head and say, like, is this actually a problem? Look at it empirically and be able to adjust for that. But the idea that you're trying to actually, that Britain has started this process of trying to deal with serious social issues by just getting people to shut up.
Yes.
That's a downward spiral.
Yes, quite. On the topic of free speech, let's look at how the media is reporting on Graham Linehan's UK arrest over his ex-post's using Ground News. We've partnered with Ground News because their app and website help cut through bias and gives the full picture on any story. Take this example. Left-leaning The Canary ran the headline, "Turf Loser, Graham Linehan arrested and banned from tweeting by police," attacking Graham as a, quote, loser. Meanwhile, right-leaning National Review led with, "England's arrest of Graham Linehan was an act of calculated tyranny," calling the arrest calculated. Same story, two completely different narratives. Ground News makes it easy to see through bias reporting and see key details which highlight how the media could be manipulating you and your information. That's why their blind spot feed is so valuable. It highlights the stories underreported by either sides so you don't miss what matters. I genuinely believe in what Ground News is doing. Check it out by scanning the QR code or visiting ground.news/Winston. If you subscribe through my link, you'll get 40% off unlimited access. Ground News is subscriber funded, and by supporting them, you are also supporting this show. For every scalp they get, they win 1,000 sealed lips.
Absolutely.
So just on Graham Linehan, so you mentioned he's a comic, and I actually think that they were jokes. The 3 tweets he made in April were jokes, and he was arrested by armed police, which is a big deal because we don't have armed police upon arrival at London Heathrow Airport. And as we speak now, I think he's facing he's in the courts dealing with it, and he's released a recording of it all, and he's run afoul of the trans the trans radical activists who are constantly
who everyone is terrified of, and even so terrified that they're afraid to admit that they're terrified of them.
Yes, quite.
And finally, Malcolm Gladwell, came out yesterday saying, like, listen, I was cowed into not objecting to the idea that biological men, are going to be superior in sports, in most sports, to biological women. And he admitted that he was just afraid, of the blowback. And then, of course, you see people responding, he wasn't scared. And it's like, you're trying to rewrite history. Everybody was scared to say this. Everybody, like the viciousness of the activists, going back, decades, but becoming particularly intense over the last 10 years is something we all lived through and to a degree are still living through.
How significant is Malcolm Gladwell talking out on this? I'm not really particularly familiar with his politics, although I assume he's sort of coming from a lefty position.
I'd say he's I would describe him as center left. I think there's other people who describe him as decidedly left. But him talking about it is very important.
Did he give specifics about it?
Yeah.
Was there? When did this happen? That he was?
I think it happened yesterday.
He spoke out yesterday. When did he claim that he was scared into silence?
He was on a panel where there was someone saying essentially, like, listen, you just have to let trans athletes win. Like if they're going to win, you just have to get used to the fact that they're going to beat the girls. Like in some cases, and he's ashamed of the fact he didn't chime in. To be like, no, that sounds crazy.
Yeah, so that's a sort of another indicator that particular topic, in America at least, is moving in a direction towards sanity.
Well, here, actually, you could probably help me with this. I kind of thought when it came to Britain, but with the Cass report, which was saying something that we also all knew, that when we started this, massive level of experimentation, frankly, with treating gender dysphoria, with, surgery and hormones, that obviously there wasn't massive data sets on something we'd actually never done before at this kind of scale. And that's essentially what the Cass Review said. Yes. So it seemed like after that came out that there was, some...
That was March, April 2024.
Yes. And that there was some common sense returning to Britain. But then when I see the clamping down on free speech related to trans issues, it makes me really wonder if that was an illusion or not.
Well, in some domains, it has been won. But in the domain of free speech, the trans activists can continue their activity because they can manipulate the mountains of legal acts and tracts that restrict speech in various ways, usually under, as you've mentioned or alluded to earlier, it's hate speech, or they can claim it's hate speech. I mean, there's quite literally dozens of restrictions on speech, and the Online Safety Act, which was painful to read, is a good example of how I think it's illegal to lie, it's illegal to there's various ways that they're censoring adults, not in the name of protecting children.
Yeah.
So that's how they're manipulating. The trans activists are just as angry.
Well, and that was the thing that struck me so much about this BBC interview, was it was first trying to do whataboutism, to basically say, well, there's problems in the United States, so isn't this hypocritical? I'm like, that's whataboutism.
Yeah.
That doesn't matter as to your problem. And like I said, I can't be called out on that anyway, because we've been nothing if not consistent. The other thing, that they tried to do was just in closing, talk about the Online Safety Act and just more or less ask me a question, assuming I'd just be like, well, of course we want to protect kids. When it's like, that's the oldest trick in the book, is just by justifying a massive sort of censorship regime by saying it's trying to protect the kids doesn't mean you should turn off your critical faculties to look at what the law nominally protecting the kids actually says.
Exactly. Maybe we can touch on how a better way to protect the kids would be. But a lot of people are saying that the Online Safety Act is going to censor Americans.
Yeah.
Now, this is something I wanted to pick apart with you, because it's not totally evident to me how.
Yeah.
And this is someone who is an opponent of the Online Safety
Sure.
Act. Now, one way which is clear to me is that it outlines that if companies do not abide by what is written in the Act and on various restrictions, they could be fined up to £18 million or 10% of global, or if not global revenue, maybe it's only revenue. I think it is actually global revenue. So that's obviously, if it's an American-owned business, they can be punished for not going along with British laws there. But beyond that, have you got any insight into how Americans would actually be censored by it?
I wasn't really thinking beyond that.
Right,
essentially, that seems sufficient to me. I mean, Kiwi Farms and 4chan, just launched a lawsuit basically defending against this argument.
What's Kiwi Farms?
Kiwi Farms is it's a website that has a lot of sort of like gender critical people posting from it. 4chan, of course, like
the ultimate shit posting.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But they just launched a lawsuit in Britain trying to make sure that, and it's a variety of British laws, don't apply to them in the United States, because they don't do any business in the United States other than run a website that you can access. They don't do any business in the UK other than having a website that you can access in the UK. And I said this last night on a podcast as well. If there's anybody listening to this who has an American company who's being told that because of content that are posted, in the United States, that they can be fined in Britain for that content, please contact FIRE, because I would love to, because we need to make sure that the sinking of free speech in the Anglosphere, in the European Union, and for that matter, of course, China, Russia, Iran, etc., doesn't sink it here. And since we are so interconnected, that's a very real threat.
Yeah, so that's interesting that you care about free speech across the world, not just America. But one thing I've noticed being here in the States is how much Americans, or perhaps it's conservative Americans, care about Britain and what's going on. So the Telegraph, the British Telegraph, reported that Trump had sent a delegation to explore how silent prayer was being censored, if you can imagine, which is actually true. That has been happening in Britain.
That case, yeah.
So it goes beyond how Americans have been censored. The Americans seem to care about how Brits are being censored by the Brits, to the extent where they're sending people over. They're spending time. They're speaking about it publicly now. Representative Jim Jordan's been another one. But I want to understand, why do Americans care about Britain so much?
Because we see you're our closest. You're like our sister country. You're really our mother country, but we see ourselves as very similar to you guys. And if it can happen in Britain, it can happen in the United States.
Okay,
and that's why it scares us so much specifically.
So it's a sort of deep cultural connection. So it's an emotional reason rather than.
But it's also practical. I mean, we have similar legal systems. We have similar histories. We had for a long time similar laws, and we have similar traditions of liberalism, of small L liberalism. Like we both at least nominally love people like John Locke, and a lot of the founding fathers of the United States were inspired by British and British thinkers, including a lot of Scottish ones as well.
Yeah,
So I think that the idea that this could happen, if it could happen in Britain, it can happen here, is one of the things that haunts us. Whereas when things happen in Germany, for example, which has an awful, speech regime in Germany,
Yes.
Very proudly bragging about the fact that they arrested someone for calling a politician a penis, which is just like, are you joking?
Yes, there's some misogynistic. Well, there's actually one AfD politician, so a conservative politician, who was arrested for, as you alluded to earlier in this conversation, mentioning crimes associated with Afghan immigrants, and just by printing the data, I think she was arrested for it.
It's a hate fact.
It's a hate fact.
Yeah,
yeah, quite. Oh dear.
But when it comes to Germany, we feel a little more distant from them, even though, a lot of Americans can trace their origins back there. We know they have a different history, more horrific history in so many ways. So there's a little bit of they're not really analogous to the United States to begin with. I think we're kind of letting them off the hook, to be honest. But when it comes to Britain, we very much see that as what our future might look like.
And what about the European Union Digital Services Act?
The European Union has become the place where innovation goes to die. I think the actual, structure of the European Union is a place that is basically the first. I don't know what the term for it would be. I'm sure there's an existing term for it, but it's like a bureaucratocracy, where essentially it doesn't have the normal sort of give and take and public feedback of an elective representative democracy. For example. And it acts kind of like, what if you put the campus administrators on American elite campuses in charge of everything? And it seems like there doesn't seem to be an opportunity for innovation that the Europeans don't want to regulate out of existence. So when it comes to some of the Digital Security Act stuff, we've seen companies kind of tripping over themselves to make sure they don't run afoul to it. And we do see that potentially as a threat to, we actually see it almost guaranteed to be a threat to freedom of speech in the United States. Can you be more, spell that out for me? So how so specifically? Because of American companies operating in the EU? Because of American companies operating in the EU, and generally, and this is something the European Union has tried several times. Now, for example, an example of a law that I think is just truly ridiculous, and it sounds on a shallow analysis of it kind of nice. It's the right to be forgotten. And the right to be forgotten is this European idea that essentially if you did something nasty in your past, but it doesn't make you look good now and it's been a while, that you can have Google take down any links or delist the links, that show that you did that thing. And the incentives are all to prevent Google or any of these companies from ever bothering to fight. And to Americans, this is horrifying because, what you do after you go on or before you go on a date with someone is try to figure out if they've, been involved in something horrible a couple of years ago, It's like, I don't know. But what's striking about it, and Australia has tried this as well, is they tried to get it enforced all over the world. There was a ruling from one of the European courts saying, that this right to be forgotten has to be enforced on the rest of the globe, and it's like, no, you don't get to tell everyone else, that they can't know something because you prefer they not. So this idea that sort of the European Union very much wants their policies to some degree sort of bind the rest of the globe. Wow.
The Europeans, I guess, have a lot of reasons why they might want people to forget their history. So maybe it comes from that. So we mentioned in passing the idea of protecting children, and as a consequence, the sort of in the name of safety, we have to restrict speech. And I just wondered, what would be a better way of protecting children?
Yeah, I mean, I'm the co-author of Coddling of the American Mind.
Fantastic book. Very influential in my thinking, I'd say.
Thank you. No, I appreciate it.
Which you co-authored with
Jonathan Haidt, yeah. And it's actually, it's 10 years old this month was the publication of the original article, Coddling of the American Mind. And so I am very concerned about, kids being affected negatively by social media, for example. But I am first and foremost concerned with the centralization of governmental power over any institutions, because it never ends where it begins. They always accumulate more power. They use it in the interest of power. And next thing you know, and very quickly, in fact, it ends up being utterly politicized. And it suddenly means that the government has its hooks in private business to an even greater degree than it already has. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, is a formula for tyranny. So I think the best way to address these things, and actually the first way that has no First Amendment issues at all is no phones in schools. Like having it officially be a policy of saying you check your phone at the beginning of the day and you get it back at the end of the day. And sometimes people will object to this from like a kind of free speech argument. And I always say it's like, they wouldn't have let you had a fax machine, a VCR, a television, a telephone on your desk when we were in school. Or a yo-yo for that matter.
Distracting, yeah.
Anything that would distract you. So even outside of the mental health argument, like the idea that you should be allowed to have a phone as some kind of free speech right, I think is silly. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a nice way to have a long respite from the phone-based childhood, as John calls it.
I don't think that's good enough. Right.
But I think that's step one. Step two is doing it in a way that doesn't actually involve as much government coercion. Essentially what you want to do is pressure industries and not actually make requirements that give companies more power over these industries, because that will get abused, and I can basically guarantee it. Because think about the worst aspects of sort of a British sort of neo-Victorianism, like the idea that they would get to decide like what moral content is on social media platforms. That's the predictable outcome of the government having too much influence over these companies.
Mm-hmm. So, but I don't still work out how that exactly is going to protect children, because the children will get around they will download a VPN if there's any sort of restrictions that they're meeting. And just for a little bit of more context, the Online Safety Act, which I've mentioned, started with the suicide of a young English girl called Molly Russell. I think she was about 14 and she'd been bullied online, and it come to that. That was what inspired a conservative government to do something about it. And at the same time, as an important side, was that there was a British conservative politician called Sir David Amess who was murdered by an Islamist at his surgery constituency.
Yeah.
And all of not just all politicians, but the conservative politicians, I keep saying that because of how striking that is.
Yeah.
They didn't talk about the problem of Islamism, which was the problem of the ideologies that had inspired the killing, but rather about online hate and like how to stop online radicalization.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that as long as kids have the phones, they're going to be susceptible to this.
Yeah.
And so short of actually banning smartphones for, let's say, under 16-year-olds, which might sound totalitarian, but I'm not saying ban phones. Maybe they can have like a regular, like an old Nokia or whatever.
Yeah.
How exactly are you going to protect them?
Yeah, I think that if you have, pressure on the major phone makers to basically make the default setting something that parents can turn on and turn off, essentially,
it's as simple as that.
Yeah, and I think that actually could solve this problem in a way that doesn't require a massive expansion of governmental power.
So give the power to the parents to help them,
and make it simple. Make it something that's actually pretty easy to understand, and it's more or less like when you get your phone, and you get it for your kids, you can either choose boom, boom.
Right. Okay.
Kids' phone, adult phone.
And are there any problems with that? Is that are people going to complain that children don't have free speech then, or is it going to?
Well, my solution to that is that if I'm buying a phone for my kid, I get to decide how he uses that phone.
Yeah,
and I'm saying he because I have two boys.
Mm-hmm.
But I also started working when I was 11, and my workaround for that is, if I'm paying for the phone myself, if this is my own money, then sure, I can decide which setting I want on that. Mm-hmm. But I think that would ultimately deal with both the problem, 90% of the problem, but also allow for autonomy I was a very mature kid, and if you told me, at 15 that I had to be on the kiddie settings, I'd be like, go to hell. I pay for this myself, boop.
Yeah. And also, but even if the parent had locked it a 15-year-old kid's going to work out how to get around it.
But there's no solution that you can come up with, other than
But that's better than adults getting censored as a consequence.
Exactly.
So it's kind of like there's no perfect solution.
There's never any. But, like as Thomas Sowell would like to say, it's always trade-offs.
So I want to talk about what's going on in America now, a bit more specifically. So, as you mentioned, led by Representative Jim Jordan yesterday in Congress was hearings about British free speech. But Trump is in power, and Trump has been accused, in fact, you mentioned it earlier, some of his failings. I wanted to kind of get your analysis of where Trump, the so-called free speech president who regularly talks about bringing back free speech to America, has he been consistent? Certainly a lot of left-wingers are claiming that they don't have free speech like they used to. And I can mention some examples, but maybe before we do that, maybe you can give me your analysis.
Sure. I mean, and I'm certainly, I've led the charge against sort of wokeism, or as Tim Urban likes to call it, social justice of fundamentalism, which is a term I really like.
Yeah,
it's self-descriptive, and, I've never shied away from taking on the left on anything. And I do think the Trump administration ushered in an era on which sort of social justice fundamentalism is on its back heel. It's not defeated, and I get really worried when people seem to be like, "Oh, thank goodness that's over." I'm like, it is not over by any stretch.
Mamdani's sort of signals to me that it's not. He's a kind of new version, a new transmogrification of woke that's emerging in New York.
I'm sad that I have to argue about Lenin being a monster with both the right and the left now. Sometimes
what the right seem to be pro-Lenin.
Bannon says nice things about
You're kidding.
about Lenin.
What does he say?
That he's self-described as a Leninist before. Like it's crazy. And I'm like, you mean the monster that my family fled Russia because he wanted to kill all of us? Like monster number one of the 20th century, the one who started the whole thing.
Yeah.
But I have fairly strong feelings about Lenin.
That's very. I mean, let's have a little stop at Lenin, if you don't mind, because Lenin, firstly, under he created the gulags.
Yep.
Like it started under him. Under him, I think Robert Conquest, the historian, puts the number about 12 million killed under Lenin. That might be the top end of the range, but certainly in the millions.
Well, the way he did a lot of those executions was by the very work-intensive bullet in the back of the head in a lot of cases. And one of the reasons why we knew we were dead is that we were, nominally.
Your family?
Oh, sorry. So my family is Grigory Vasilyevich Lukianoff. My dad is Vasily Vasilyevich, and his father was Vasily Ivanich, and we were descended from serfs. My great grandfather bought his way to freedom in 1858. But we were peasants who made good. We were successful peasants, and that's true. Like statistically speaking, there weren't that many of us in terms of the most peasants remained very poor, but we were actually doing quite well, and that made us especially bad.
Would they be kulaks? Is that, or was that a Ukrainian thing?
Kulak is a made up term.
Oh, okay.
So potentially, yeah. I mean, like we could have just been lumped together with the entire sort of like aristocracy, roughly,
bourgeoisie, okay.
Because we were successful. But a kulak was just the idea that there was a peasant who made good, essentially, a success story in any other country.
Right.
We would have just been shot in the back of the head if my grandfather had stayed. And it may sound kind of funny that I'm talking about my grandfather, not my great-great-grandfather now.
Right.
But my dad is 99. So my great-grandfather was actually born in 1880. My grandfather was born in 1888 and fought both in World War I and in the Bolshevik Revolution. And I'm sorry to apologize, but we lost. And Lenin really set this whole thing in motion. And the extent to which the different totalitarians were inspired by each other's sort of cruelty and depravity, it's a fact. I mean, like the extent to which Mussolini was studying Lenin, and so was, so obviously so was Stalin, but so was Hitler as well. Like they had different awful totalitarian visions with different emphases, but they all came from this idea that ideology, that one true ideology must shrink everything else, and the only way to do it is through force and blood.
You know, I was online the other day and I stumbled across this video. It was from Chuck Norris and it left me a little shocked. He's in his 80s and says he feels like he's in his 50s. He had some pretty cool tips in there too on what he's doing, including these 3 foods that he avoids like the plague. Now, at first I was a bit skeptical, but he explained all the things he was doing and it was super simple. If it's good enough for Chuck, then it's good enough for all of us. But with any new method, of course, results can vary. The video is definitely worth checking out, and here is a special link just for you watchers of the Winston Marshall Show. Watch the video now at chuckdefense.com/win. That's Chuck Defense. That's a defense with an S rather than a C, .com/win. To make it even easier, I linked it below the video and you can check it out yourself. It's pretty quick and seriously, it's been a game changer. Now, back to the interview. You know, famously, Hitler and Mussolini as fascists were, I'm not sure, would you call Hitler technically a fascist or a national socialist? Was very, obviously Mussolini was a fascist, completely anti-Bolshevik.
Yeah.
And Stalin himself wrote a whole book about why Lenin was wrong, or what Lenin got wrong.
Yeah.
So they were anti-Lenin on a range thing. They were anti-Lenin, right?
Yeah.
How exactly were they?
So Marxist-Leninism, that ultimately the similarities, outweigh the differences. So a lot of times people, one, centralization of power, utility of violence, total control over the information, total control over speech, making sure that only the party is in charge. These are also the hallmarks that they all had in common. And then when people point out, when people really try to draw this huge distinction between communism and fascism/Nazism. But as I said, I think the similarities outweigh the differences. But they point to the racism because National Socialism had because in communism, the idea is that it's an internationalist movement, that essentially anybody in theory potentially could be, part of their movement. And that sounds nicer. And in many ways it is. It's more universalist. But Nazism, fascism was an idea of the important unit is the nation state and the race. And so they were much more explicitly racist. But when people really talk about that as being the major difference between that and Soviet communism, I'm kind of like, well, are you telling me that the Soviets weren't actually racist, that there wasn't actually substantial racism actually in the Soviet Union? Then I feel like you've possibly never met a Russian or know your history very well.
No, quite.
Was it less dramatic and awful than the horrors that happened under Hitler? Yes, undoubtedly. But in terms of both being totalitarian systems with very similar aspects all the way through, that it makes it a little bit ridiculous when still people on the left will say, oh, but that's that's fascism, but somehow have a soft spot for communism. It's monstrous and also bad history.
Well, we actually had Nathan Sharansky on the show when we were starting, and he's perfect. We had a good conversation about how anti-Semitism was rife throughout. I mean, even before, obviously, the communists came to power. But it seemed to me that one thing that game they did play, and now we're kind of heading away from free speech a little bit, was that
Sure.
Whereas the communists made it about class, the Nazis made it about race.
Yes.
But they kind of played the same game. There's an oppressor group who we need to get rid of because of all the kind of evil.
And that's about the idea of the Volk, essentially, which kind of combined race and class, essentially like the Volk being the regular working people. And I actually don't think it's that divorced from freedom of speech, because when this stuff starts rearing its head and we didn't have a reckoning about being like, oh my, so Alan Charles Coors is a co-founder of FIRE, and he gave this absolutely beautiful speech that Daniel Schuckman just wrote about in the Wall Street Journal, talking about we never had our after socialism moment. We never had the moment where we said, oh my God, this was a monstrous period in human history where rights were thrown to one side, it's bathed in blood, and we never actually had the moment.
In America.
In the world.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that if we're refusing to, and I think in a lot of ways we have refused to actually think about this, we're going to go back into a tyranny. Again. So I do actually think this is closely related to free speech, because the biggest threat to free speech in the 20th century was ideology.
One thing we've covered a lot on this show is that not having reckoned with socialism and communism, and it's kind of took the wrong lessons from the Second World War, and I think we're seeing that play out in a very weird way, particularly here in America, where a lot of right wingers are interpreting that as the wrong people won. That's kind of a weird perversion of 1945. But it is the case that communism and socialism got an easy go. I mean, everyone from Karl Popper, who was not that harsh on Karl Marx.
Isn't that crazy, though? I mean, because I'm such a Karl Popper fan, but it's clear that he was raised believing that Karl Marx was essentially a nice, well-meaning man. Yeah. And he he totally savages Hegel, which I love. He totally savages Plato's Republic, which I love. And then he gets to Marx, and he's kind of like, well, you know.
He might be wrong, but, you know, his intentions are clearly in the right place. And
then in the Open Society, and it's one of like the later editions of it, there's this kind of note, I think it's like a paragraph where he says, like, the recent biography that I read, I didn't realize like he was such a terrible person.
Yes, that's correct. He does kind of put as a weird caveat, but it's not particularly heavy-handed caveat.
And it's like, and that's such an understatement. He was a horrible person.
Yeah.
Now, I say this all the time, and this was one of the points in my book, Canceling of the American Mind, is that bad people can have good ideas as well. But I do find it particularly ironic that oftentimes the same people who will try to cancel David Hume for having a racist footnote in 1752 totally give Karl Marx and I think David I can't think of his name right now, but he will give Karl Marx a pass, even though he was deeply racist, incredibly anti-Semitic, even though his family was Jewish, maybe even because his family was Jewish.
But not David Hume.
But David Hume, for having a footnote, let's erase him. But Karl Marx, his heart was in the right place.
Well, actually, where I think this Popper links to free speech is that a lot of the attitude against free speech, I think, starts with the never again lessons from World War II.
Yeah.
And Karl Popper, I mean, viewers who regularly watch the show will maybe be bored of me talking about Karl Popper.
The paradox of tolerance?
Yes, exactly, which is a deep footnote in that book, The Open Societies, where he says, we've got to have, and the whole book argues we've got to have freedom and liberalism, and we've got to work against authoritarianism. But in this footnote, we must not tolerate the intolerance, and it's pretty explicit in being anti. He's shown his limits there, which I think had a huge, despite it being a footnote, was hugely impactful philosophically in the idea of closing down hate speech.
And to me, like, they're not even reading the footnote right, because like the beginning of the footnote seems to be saying that we should have done more to shut down the Nazis, and there are a million different ways they could have shut down the Nazis that didn't involve going after their speech. They were murderers. It would have been incredibly easy to go after them on that. And by the way, Weimar, and this is something Popper probably didn't know or remember, Weimar Germany did punish the Nazis for speech. It wasn't the fact that Weimar was incredibly tolerant.
Is that right?
Yeah, of freedom of speech. It's called the Weimar fallacy. It even has a name. The Nazis went to jail for saying anti-Semitic things, for real. And guess what happened when they got out of jail? The Nazis would throw them a big party, and they'd turn it into a big PR coup that essentially,
because they're martyrs.
Yeah, because they're martyrs. Exactly. And so the first part of it seems to be saying we could have done more to stop the Nazis, of the footnote, and absolutely they could have. The second part gets a little bit, seems almost self-contradictory to the first part of it, but, with some sort of nice sounding language about not tolerating intolerance. And
even not tolerating things that might incite intolerance.
Yeah.
So it's, again, that word incites in there. All of this language, as we're still using it.
Yeah, and I think it's used to justify things that Popper never would have supported, including, the kind of hate speech laws that we currently have. I think it's much more specific about the scenario that's exactly like...
I'm not clear about, a lot of people make this argument because a lot of the book is about... freedom and freedom of speech, but the fact that he wrote that, it might be that it was a failing in his own thinking.
Yeah,
and that it might be the case he didn't actually support all free speech.
Yeah.
So
I think it's all, if you live through the horrors of World War II, there might be some caveat or somebody sort of niggling at your consciousness, or literally someone being kind of like, hey, maybe you should make a footnote about this. It's like, fine,
Right.
But I think the overall, I think his overall oeuvre is about freedom, with a caveat that ended up being, again, in a footnote, which probably should have been ignored to a large degree because it's a freaking footnote, but has been leapt on by people to say basically, well, this justifies my entire anti-free speech, anti-open society regime.
Yeah.
Which he'd probably be pretty horrified by.
The footnote that changed the West.
Yes.
So we were actually going to talk about Trump before this wonderful detour. I guess the most outrage about Trump's behavior, and it's been called an attack on free speech, has been at the universities.
Yeah.
So he's refused funding for several universities on the grounds that they're breaching the Civil Rights Act. This is specifically to do with anti-Semitism and the failure to deal with anti-Semitism on campuses, particularly after October 7th. People are upset about it. Can you just lay out the situation as you see it? Do you think it's a free speech issue?
Oh, I do, yeah.
Yeah. So please explain.
It takes a little bit of developing, but I can do it relatively quickly. Harassment rationales have been the justification for the modern era of speech codes on campus since at least the 1980s.
What's a harassment rationale?
Harassment basically means that creating new speech codes and new restrictions on freedom of speech based on the idea that you're not stopping offensive speech, you're stopping harassment, was the same thing that the founders of critical race theory, including Richard Delgado, Mary Matsuda, Kimberly Crenshaw, all kind of coalesced around to say this is how we'll actually be able to justify a new era of speech codes. Because Richard Delgado was he's the guy who wrote Words That Wound back in 1980, and he wanted to stop, he's kind of the pioneer in stopping, racist hate speech, but trying to figure out legal rationales that he could actually use. And one of them was fighting words, which is an exception in the under the Supreme Court, which was a dead end because basically the fighting words doctrine is more or less dead in the United States.
What's a fighting words?
Fighting words is literally like a face-to-face confrontation that's going to lead to a fight where if
you say I'm going to kill you or something. Or...
No, that's a threat.
Okay.
Fighting words would be like someone saying, "Well, your mother," like some kind of insult that would make a reasonably macho.
Your mother's a whore.
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
a reasonably macho dude pop you one. It's a very 1940s kind of idea, and it's never been upheld since first being established in the 1940s by the Supreme Court, at least. So first, Richard Delgado tried that, but they also tried to really redefine offensive speech on the basis of sex or race as harassment. And they did this very directly by, I think at my alma mater, Stanford, they were saying speech that stigmatizes or victimizes on the basis of race or sex, which sounds like strong language, but it's incredibly vague, incredibly broad, and it really is just saying speech that's offensive on the basis of sex and race. So that was the original sort of attempt to have politically correct censorship on campus going back to the 1980s.
And was that actually implemented?
It was implemented, and it was defeated in court every single time one of these codes was challenged for, we started challenging them. So there was a period from about 1989 to 1995 where I think 4 or 5 of these were challenged, all of them shot down by courts.
And that period was the sort of first political correct.
Yes.
Would you talk about this in your brilliant book with Ricky Schlott, The Cancelling of the American
Isn't she the best? She's been on your show, right?
She hasn't been on the show. I'd love to get her on the show, but she is an incredible journalist and a great admirer of her work.
Yeah.
And she's a great person as well. But no, there's another book I highly recommend to listeners and viewers. But sorry, you were saying.
So the first great age of political correctness I define as 85 to 95. And that's when you had this politically correct kind of fever sort of burst on campus. The passage of speech codes just really 10 years after the Supreme Court decisions that gave students very strong free speech rights, and about 20 years after the free speech movement started at Berkeley. So there's tremendous irony here, of course. And then they start passing speech codes to go after speech they don't like. Very, very Marcusian. And that during that period, when a lot of these codes were passed at University of Wisconsin passed one, University of Michigan passed one, Central Michigan University passed one as well, and Stanford were among some of them. All of them were shot down by courts. And so there was a sense that Thank goodness that craziness is all over. But when I started at Fire in 2001 as the first legal director, we found that in some cases, language that was identical to the kind of speech codes that got overturned during the first grade of political correctness were still on the books, including one of the craziest codes that got at University of Connecticut. I make this face because it got overturned in an unpublished opinion, and I hate unpublished opinions. But the speech code at UConn was saying that laughing in a mocking way or laughing in an offensive way potentially could count as harassment. And they still had this policy on the books at several schools that we saw when I first started my career. So harassment's been abused my entire career. So I think it's really important that people understand this background, which is why we at Fire were very concerned that the administration was going with a harassment rationale in going after some of the really, and to be clear, very real problems going on.
So Trump's administration are using the old sort of left-wing harassment idea to take on the university's anti-Semitism problem.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's concerning to us. When it comes to, so one thing that I also need to establish, I think American higher education needs massive reform. Like, I think it's even if it was just cost and administrative bloat by itself, it would still need massive reform. But I think it has a very deep free speech problem and a very deep academic freedom problem. But when Trump started going after universities, I think the most vulnerable one that they went after first was Columbia. I think that's the one that you were most likely to get a finding that essentially they did allow an anti-Semitic environment at Columbia. I think they were the most vulnerable there. They've since settled.
How did they allow it?
That they didn't prosecute, they didn't kick out people who engaged in anti-Semitic harassment, and or for that matter, in some cases, actual threats of assault, for example.
There was some literal violence as well at Columbia University or Gaza Plaza.
Absolutely. No, Columbia allowed things that they absolutely should not have allowed happen.
Okay.
So they were the most vulnerable, but they settled with the administration, and
what did they settle?
They settled for a large sum of money and a number of conditions that I don't think will actually fix the problem at Columbia. But the most problematic one, the one that we have the biggest issue with, is how the Trump administration handled Harvard. Now, here's another thing that's worth knowing. Every school in the country is vulnerable on a civil rights claim on the basis that they engage in racial discrimination in terms of admissions and hiring. And this is not just since the Students for Fair Admission loss that Harvard had about affirmative action.
Which was against Asian students, 2023, if I'm not mistaken, who sued. It got to the Supreme Court because they had not been admitted because Asians, I guess, would be a group of overachievers, and even though they'd succeeded, they didn't get in.
It's an amazing opinion that everyone should read, particularly the details of when they show just how extreme the discrimination actually was. Yes. And the deeply offensive argument was essentially that the Asian students got lower personality scores. Which was one of the tactics that they used against Jews in the 1920s and 30s, is they gave them a lower score on some kind of amorphous kind of like, well, they're not as cool, It's like, no, that's crazy.
Wow.
And so they're all vulnerable on that. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of these schools actually did end up settling, is because they realized that they're doing something that they knew was probably illegal.
Yes.
But when it comes to the handling of Harvard, Harvard finished dead last in Fire's campus free speech rankings 2 years in a row, and they earned that last place. So I am not anybody who's pulled any punches when it comes to Harvard.
You just published that like a month or so ago.
Oh, no, actually the new one comes out next week.
Oh, okay. So this is from next week's. Okay. So
next week, I can't say what happens in next week's yet. Okay. But this is the last 2 years.
Okay. Well, we'll put a pin in this because I want to come back to how it is exactly they've been deemed so terrible. But just a quick interruption to share some exciting news. I'll be hosting the first ever Winston Marshall Show meetup. It'll be for paid subscribers in New York City sometime on the week of September 6th. If you want to connect with the community, ask your questions face-to-face and chat about the topics we cover on this show in person, this is the perfect opportunity. Spaces will be limited, so head over to Substack right now, become a paid supporter, and get access to this and hopefully many more meetups to come. So that's New York City between the 6th and 14th of September. More information will be released soon. Head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk. That is our Substack, and you'll get more information, and I look forward to seeing you there. But let's get back to the interview.
So the way they could have dealt with Harvard is one. I think that there was a good chance that if they followed the procedures that were in place, that Harvard would have been found guilty of violating Title VI for permitting
Of the Civil Rights Act,
Title VI,
1964.
of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 for permitting anti-Semitic harassment. I think there was a real chance. I don't think there's much in the way of a question that they could have been found, violating the various titles for their admissions policies as well. But what the Trump administration did was, rather than start the process or finish or get anywhere near finishing the process as guaranteed under the law, they sent a letter that said, this is your settlement offer. Essentially, we will now have influence. We will now essentially control what you teach, who you hire, who you admit, basically all the essential functions of a university. And it's like, no, that's nationalizing Harvard. Mm-hmm. And that's not within the presidential power to do. And so the Trump administration tried a variety of different tactics to sort of strong-arm Harvard into accepting this, including, for example, saying that because of national security concerns, we're going to hereby say that you can't have any international students, but then only banned it for Harvard. And it's like that didn't fly with the judge because it obviously just seemed like just another tool that the Trump administration was using against.
But that's because is that to do with Harvard using CCP-affiliated organizations? So it was specifically Harvard who were vulnerable to China exposure.
Yeah, and but if you wanted to actually make that not seem like a pretext, then you talk about every school in the country that has Department of Defense contracts. So it just looked transparently like another way of pressuring specifically Harvard. So the way they went about it raised all sorts of civil liberties concerns. And it's frustrating to me, as someone who cares deeply about higher education reform, that they took this path that led to defeat after defeat after defeat in court. And they were just defeated yesterday in court again on First Amendment grounds. And Harvard launched a lawsuit basically saying that the freezing, for example, of all the funding in order to, have greater control over, who they admit in the curriculum and all of these things was something that violated Harvard's First Amendment rights, including their freedom of association, for example. Mm-hmm. So again, I care deeply about higher education reform, but the powers that the administration tried to take on in dealing with Harvard way exceeded the powers of the actual presidency.
Right. How is this relevant to the harassment clause you mentioned earlier? You said that the Trump administration were using the harassment clause, but how does that fit into what you've described?
That one of the things that the Trump administration has wanted is that that schools move to a cumulative theory of harassment. This is a little bit in the weeds, but it's important. Where essentially harassment is usually defined as I did something horrible to you and I can I can be found guilty of harassing you. That at least makes some amount of sense. Mm-hmm. And particularly if it follows a good definition of harassment, like severe, persistent, or pervasive behavior that targets you, then we don't have an issue with it. In fact, like if you're engaging that kind of behavior, it's not even really speech. It's a pattern of discriminatory behavior. Mm-hmm. And we've been advocating for this forever. But if you change it to this person over there said that thing that was upsetting to you, and this person over there said that thing that was upsetting to you, and then I did something that would have been protected on my own, but was also cumulatively the thing that actually made you feel that you were harassed, mm-hmm. that I can be held responsible for that, is a really easy way to allow a weapon that, by the way, will also be used like crazy by the left on campuses as well, but also by the right.
So if we zoom out one moment.
Sure.
it does appear to me that these universities were in breach of the Civil Rights Act. I don't think that, for me, that's not contentious.
Yeah.
And I do think it's unfair that the federal government should fund universities that are breaching the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah.
Why should working people of America pay for these elite schools, especially if they're racist, like as they've been? So if the Trump administration are going about it all wrong, what would be the right way to go about it?
Well, I mean, Congress has to be involved, simply. And I think that the free pass on schools, violating the Civil Rights Act, once it's clear that the sort of way that universities have just been kind of ignoring various aspects of it, particularly in hiring and admissions, will no longer be tolerated. I think universities are not going to like complying, but they will, because it's been this very kind of weird situation where. And the left really hasn't caught on to this aspect, because basically when students for fair admissions got rid of the basically affirmative action at admissions for colleges, there was such a belief that this was such a high moral good that I think it didn't really sink in all that well, that once you take away the special exception that was allowed for affirmative action under a handful of cases, and not even in the form that universities were actually doing it, by the way, but once you actually took away any excuse whatsoever for this to be anything other than just racial discrimination, it doesn't suddenly become something that's slightly disfavored. It goes back entirely to being completely illegal racial discrimination. Mm-hmm. And that has not really sunk in at schools. And I think that now it's probably starting to, and the free pass is probably over, on that. But Congress needs to be involved in some of this stuff, because they're the ones who are supposed to decide things like what the funding conditions are, and all of that. And the NIH involvement, research funding being used as a tool to sort of coerce behavior at a university, it troubles me deeply, because the idea that people might not get, a treatment for cancer because because aspects of the administration at Harvard are crazy ideologues. It's kind of like, punishing someone completely unrelated.
Is that actually happening?
Yeah. That was one of the things that the court ruled yesterday, is essentially like that funding has to be reinstated.
Wow.
So I have some hope. So just to switch over briefly to the National Institutes of Health, I have some real hope for Jay Bhattacharya there. I think his idea that the NIH should be massively funding replication studies is a wonderful idea. I think that the NIH should be funding younger scholars. Absolutely wonderful idea. I think there's all sorts of ways in which NIH conditions can be used to the benefit of free speech, academic freedom, et cetera, all this kind of stuff. But using it specifically as a tool in order to get a university to sign a settlement agreement, that often involves entirely different cast of characters, I'm not so okay with that.
So the other big scandalous thing with regards to Trump, or rather the Trump administration, has been the issue of free speech for pro-Palestinians. Yeah. And I use the term pro-Palestinian. Yeah. And that's what they claim to be. Yeah. But
don't seem to care very much about the Palestinians who get killed anytime they actually protest or mention or protest against Hamas.
Quite. It's. I think it'd be more accurate to call them pro-Hamas, but. Okay, let's try and for now. I'll reserve that.
A lot of times at Fire
discussion,
we try to use the term that people prefer to be called.
Yes, quite.
Even if it sticks in your throat.
I prefer to use progressive to work, although you prefer social justice fundamentalism. But they don't say social justice fundamentalism. Yeah, they say progressive. So I try and say progressive. But anyway,
that makes sense. Yeah.
The most famous of these is Mahmoud Khalil.
Yeah,
and this was a very interesting case for me about the limits of free speech.
Yeah.
There was a big argument of people saying he had his First Amendment. So the story was that he had been I think a spokesperson for the CUAD, the Columbia University Apartheid Divest group. On their Substack, they had horrific essays written pro-Sinwar, pro-Hezbollah, pro the Houthis. I read through it. I'm like, I can't believe this is coming out of an American university. And they obviously were organizing a lot of the protests. And this guy was not an American citizen.
Yeah.
And so then there was an argument about, does he have First Amendment rights?
Yeah.
And then there's another part of the American legal code, I think it's the U.S. Code 8, saying that the Secretary of State, in this case Marco Rubio, has the right to deport anyone he wants.
There's two different versions of that code.
Do they contradict each other? Or?
No, actually, one actually says that you can kick someone out if it's adverse to foreign policy. The other one just says you can kick someone out.
Right. And so where do you land on that? Was this a violation? Was what happened to Mahmoud Khalil a violation of free speech? Does he have First Amendment rights as a foreign national?
Yeah. Oh, we believe he does. And
you believe he does?
For the same reasons why. So for example, the comedian we were just talking about, Graham Linehan, he was in the United States in order to actually, avoid some of the potential of arrest in the UK.
That's not accurate.
Well, my understanding is he was.
He made the tweets in April. Mm-hmm. It's not clear to me whether or not he was in the States. And he had moved to the States because of a job. He's working with Rob Schneider, the famous comedian there out of Arizona. He's working with Andrew Doyle, who you were on his show you mentioned earlier, and Martin Goulet, a couple others. Yep. And they are working on a new sitcom out there. He moved to America not to avoid anything that's going on in Britain.
Is he working on Andrew Doyle's sitcom?
Yes, he is.
Oh my God.
They're writing that together.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So that's why Linehan was in the States, not to avoid anything, just for.
Well, I knew he was here for other reasons as well, but I thought that was at least part of it. But anyway, so basically,
maybe you're right.
Whether it's Jordan Peterson, whether it's the late great Christopher Hitchens, whether it's my own parents, whether it's Graham. Essentially, like the idea that the Secretary of State would have an unreviewable power to kick out any citizen for doing something that would be protected speech in the United States should give civil libertarians issues. And there is a case on point called Bridges v. Wixon from 1945 that specifically deals with people who are foreign nationals who are in the United States and whether or not you can kick them out for speech that would be protected under the First Amendment. And the answer was no. That essentially First Amendment does actually apply, at least to some degree, to foreign nationals. Now, that does not mean anything as ridiculous as you can't consider whether or not you don't have a subjective analysis on why you grant the visa in the first place, or why you actually will give someone a green card, for example. And I think I just absolutely accept that they're going to do that. I mean, I always make the point that, my Russian father losing his, spot in line to someone who was actually like, oh, I must overthrow the Soviets, to a person who's like, actually, I love your country, it would be ridiculous. But once they're here, kicking them out for speech that would be protected is problematic, I think, for very real reasons. And what's interesting here is the only time those provisions in the American law have been challenged in court, they were found to be too broad and vague by Trump's sister, who was a very well-respected judge who died tragically a couple of years ago, pretty young. So that was found to be too much unreviewable power to give to the Secretary of State. And unfortunately, that decision was overturned for reasons completely unrelated to that decision. So the only time that provision has been challenged. Meanwhile, one of the reasons why the Trump administration and a lot of people, actually not just the Trump administration, a lot of people, Jews on the left as well, were really mad about what Columbia was doing, was that they were refusing to expel students who had engaged in behavior that should have gotten them expelled from Columbia, because they didn't want them to lose their visas. Because if you get expelled, you have to go back to your country. So I was kind of holding my breath on the Mahmoud Khalil thing, expecting at any minute they're going to say that he did something more than be associated with a group that says horrible things, but it never happened. And so if that's all and I was like,
right, you thought he must have done something, but maybe they know something we don't, but that evidence never happened. Right.
And the even worse and clearer case was a case involving a tough student named Ramesa Ozturk. And that was a case where literally all she did was write an op-ed, not a bomb-throwing op-ed, by the way, saying something I disagree with, but that Tufts should divest from Israel. That's a perfectly protected opinion. She was the one that you saw stuffed into the van, flown to, I think, first Georgia and then I think Louisiana, held essentially in jail for weeks until a judge actually said, no, you can't kick someone out of the country for an op-ed. That's not at least who we're supposed to be. So I get that this is, like a difficult topic. I don't have sympathy, for students who have any soft spot for, Hamas whatsoever. But at the same time, the law saying that if someone's here and they're engaging in speech that would be protected for an American, deporting them immediately for that is something that doesn't fit for a country that is proud of the fact that our dissidents come here, like people who from all over the world come here. And I try to remind conservatives, it's like, think about, like a case like Graham or Jordan Peterson or something like that for a future administration and how this power would be used under like an AOC administration.
So my problem with that, Greg, is that if the Secretary of State or indeed America doesn't have control of who is and is not in their country, if they don't have the ability to remove people who are not American citizens, then they don't actually have control of their borders. And so it seems to me pretty important, and this would apply to my country just as much, is that if you don't have that power, then you don't have borders. And so it seems quite fundamental to me. Now, the second case you gave, I grant, it doesn't really necessarily apply to this, but with Mahmoud Khalil, he was supporting the CUA, the Columbia University Apartheid Divest Group, which was openly supporting enemies of America. Well, not just enemies of Israel, enemies of America. Hezbollah, if you read their manifesto, they are explicitly not just Western, and not just anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, they are anti-American. And so if you have people in America who are not American citizens, who are supporting part of organizations that are supporting anti-American activity, if America loses the ability to get rid of these people who are effectively adversaries of the state, it loses itself as a country, it seems to me.
But that's why you have that subjectivity on granting the visa in the first place. And I think what you're saying is Mahmoud Khalil should not have been granted a student visa.
No, but he started that behavior after he came here. And not only that, when you apply, and I know this as I'm a British citizen, I'm not an American citizen, but I've had visas here my entire adult life. I know that when I come here, I better be on best bloody behavior and not break the law, because otherwise they have every right to get rid of me. And fair enough, if I break the law here, they should be able to take me.
But Khalil didn't break the law.
Well, he didn't break the law because you can legally... I guess I suppose he didn't.
I'm all for kicking people out of the break law, to be clear. And although I'd be sad to see my parents go, if my dad actually robbed a liquor store or something like that, he would have gotten kicked out back when he had his green card. So that's why I was expecting them to, because there was so much, there was a lot of illegal behavior at Columbia, which was why I was kind of like, well, maybe they have him on something, more serious. And I'm still extremely puzzled by choosing someone that they didn't have something more serious on. And there have, by the way, been other deportations that Fire hasn't objected to at all, because it clearly seemed like they were involved in some kind of illegal behavior, or with a strong imposition that they had actual, literal ties to the to foreign terrorism. And in those cases, we're like, no, that's not so much a free speech issue. But when you can only point to speech that you're associated with or speech that you wrote yourself, I wouldn't want you to get kicked out for your commentary here.
I think your criticism of my position is totally fair. The only thing I would say is that if a government decided that they deemed, let's say, Jordan Peterson's words, or even mine, was against American, and they decided not they decided I should be banished from America, I might be like, this is a bit silly, but I'd be like, it's not my country, it's their country. They can say, I respect their borders. I respect that democracy in America elected these people to make these decisions. Why? I'm not going to argue this.
Well, I'd defend you.
Very good. So we mentioned earlier Harvard University being the bottom 2 years in a row.
Yes.
wait with bated breath. Perhaps it'll be moments away when this interview is published that people already know the answers for year 3.
Yeah.
What meant that they were bottom?
So I'm very proud of the Campus Free Speech rankings. Now, of course, there's no way to have a perfect ranking, but as far as the data that we're including, I'm very proud of what we've been able to accomplish. Every year, we do the largest study of student opinion ever done for U.S. campuses on the state of free speech. And this includes things like, do you feel like you can disagree with your professors or your classmates? And that on the other hand, do you think violence is okay in response to freedom of speech? Do you think, blocking people is okay or shout downs are okay? And we, group them into different things to decide your score. Then we also include our largest database of basically professor cancellations, student cancellations, deplatforming, which is when someone tries to speak at the campus that gets shut down. Oftentimes, in a lot of these cases, by activists who will shout down speakers, that counts as deplatforming, I think correctly so. And then also what their speech codes look like, what their codes relating to speech look like. We put it all together in a complex algorithm that we have a Harvard, statistician help us with, ironically. And then, we calculate how schools do in relationship to each other. And last year, University of Virginia actually came out number 1. Right behind it was Michigan Technological University, which had been the year's previous one. Technological universities, by the way, they tend to be a little more grounded. And so they've done very well. Some schools that have consistently done pretty well include University of Chicago. For example, Purdue always does great. I think, Vanderbilt has traditionally done pretty good. And Dartmouth is the school that's clearly trying the hardest among the Ivies to do better. But Harvard, when it came to their student reports, when it came to their tolerance for deplatforming, when it came to their treatment of professors, they were right at the bottom. And it's really, you won't be shocked by any of the bottom 5. The bottom 5 last year were Barnard. Barnard got literally the lowest score for whether or not the university would have your back if you got in trouble for free speech. I think there was something 3 standard deviations lower than everybody else. Basically, they were nope, they'll stab us in the back. It also included University of Pennsylvania. No surprise there. That's where they're mistreating Amy Wax. Also included Columbia and NYU. Actually, rounded out the bottom 5. But schools have been hard at work, trying to improve how they've been doing. And it's going to be a little bit of a different lineup next week. Some schools have made some real progress, so stay tuned.
Yeah, I certainly will. Greg, it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Very, very fun.
Is there anything you'd like to bring listeners and viewers' attention to?
Sure. We got some exciting stuff at Fire. I have a new book with the former president of the ACLU called The War on Words. It's about, basically it's me and Nadine answering the 10 arguments, as I would put it. Nadine's much cheerier than I am. The 10 arguments against freedom of speech that I'm sick of having to answer over and over again.
Oh, that's a good idea.
I put it into a book called War on Words, and I'm very proud of it. But also Sarah McLachlan at Fire came out with a book that I mentioned called Authoritarianism in the Academy, about how countries like Qatar and China are limiting free speech on campus. And, check out the rankings next week.
Very good. Greg Lukianoff, a great pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much, and we must do it again.
Absolutely.
Thank you for watching The Winston Marshall Show with Greg Lukianoff. If you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, you'll enjoy ad-free viewing. You'll get exclusive content, including essays that I've been writing, as well as the opportunity to ask future guests your questions. If you want to continue watching here on YouTube, I ask only that you press subscribe. If you do that, you help us continue to do what we are doing. But until next time, be well.